Thank you very much. It's an absolute delight to be here with you all, and I'm very sorry for my tardiness today. The train and traffic tried very hard to work against me, but I made it. But I do feel bad keeping you in here in this gorgeous weather for too long. So I promise there will be plenty of time for questions. Start thinking of them now. I love a good, robust Q&A session. And I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, but I talk very fast, so actually that might be a little shorter than that. So Northern Ireland has enjoyed over 25 years of peace since the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. A referendum that passed by 72% in Northern Ireland, 94% in the Republic of Ireland. And in the decades since, I find anyway, we often think about the political achievements of 1998 and the politicians who were involved. I'm sure quite a few people in this room know the names John Hume, Bertie Ahern, Bill Clinton. I'm sure, certainly, Bill. But what about names like Avila Kilmurray, or Quentin Oliver, or Matthew Taylor, or Mairead Maguire? Those names are perhaps a little less known than the big shots in political office. Today, I want to speak about their role and the role of community-based movements in effecting change in Northern Ireland in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement and in the years since then. Civic society played a key role in building reconciliation across Northern Ireland and preparing people for the prospect of having a referendum. Civic society is responsible for the first integrated education programme in Northern Ireland. In 1976, Peace People, which was founded by Mairead Maguire and Betty Williams, had massive protests trying to end the violence. In 1992, a group of civil society organisations formed the OPSAL Commission, which created a report full of submissions that actually had suggestions that ended up in the Good Friday Agreement, though that commission doesn't get credit for it. The Yes campaign for the referendum in 1998 was actually run by Quentin Oliver, who was the director of NICFA and who quit his job to run the Yes campaign. Such is the role of civic society in building up to the 1998 peace agreement. And these community-driven movements followed a global trend. In the US, you had the Civil Rights Movement, which led to significant changes from the voting rights from the Civil Rights Act. We also had movements in the UK, from movements for trying to free Nelson Mandela and get some rights in South Africa. So we know that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were significant people-based movements that actually had real effective change in society. One of the most notable civic society-driven movements in Northern Ireland is the Women's Coalition. They were founded in 1996 and were disbanded in 2006. Now, the Women's Coalition was a cross-community-based political party. They recognized that women were not at the table and decided to pull up a chair and put themselves in the room. The benefit of the Women's Coalition is that they acted as a bridge between civic society and political representatives. They held regular meetings with civic society, they articulated perspectives and views of wider society to the political institutions, and they brought forward really significant changes into the text of the Good Friday Agreement itself. They brought forward things like integrated education, a civic forum which was envisioned to be a vehicle between civic society and political representatives. We know that when women are involved in peace processes are stronger. We know that when civic society is involved in peace processes, a peace agreement is 35% more likely to be sustained for 15 years or more through that inclusion. Professor Desiree Nelson of Uppsala University in Sweden has demonstrated that peace agreements are 64% less likely to fail when civic society representatives are included. There is empirical data to support the importance of women in making and sustaining peace. An International Peace Institute study of 182 peace agreements signed between 1989 and 2011 found that when women are included in peace processes, there is a 35% increase in the probability that a peace agreement will last 15 years or more. Evidence suggests that women participants in peace processes are more likely to be focused on reconciliation, economic development, and transitional justice, all critical elements of a sustained peace. Members of the Women's Coalition brought to the table mixed housing, the reintegration of political prisoners, specific language on victims' rights, and of course, as I mentioned, the Civic Forum and integrated education, as well as inclusion of women in political participation. But the work of the Good Friday Agreement and of the Women's Coalition did not stop in 1998. It has continued, and a new generation has taken up the mantle of advancing Northern Ireland's peace process. More than 600,000 people have been born in Northern Ireland since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and they're growing up under a sustained period of peace. Identity and culture do not have the same connotations or connections for this generation as they did for their parents and grandparents. Research from the Northern Ireland Youth Forum has found a generation that is focused on mental health, climate and sustainability, and a wide range of socio-economic issues. These findings, however, also show that Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement generation are interested in politics but feel very disenfranchised from the political system. One is maybe not surprised by that when you understand how unstable Northern Ireland's mandatory power sharing system has been for the last 26 years. In fact, young people in Northern Ireland today will have not really known very much of a sustained, stable governance structure, considering that the Northern Ireland Assembly has only been sitting for 30% of the last 9 years. And when it comes to identity, we can see that the Good Friday Agreement generation also has a divide between younger and older demographics. We have research from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey that shows that a majority of young people in Northern Ireland are now identifying themselves as Irish or Northern Irish, with only 16% identifying themselves as British, while 37% of respondents aged 65 plus identified themselves as British. Rather than engage at a political level, we see a generation in Northern Ireland that is looking for other forms of political participation, which also follows other global trends. The movement which dismantled the Sudanese government, for example, was largely divided down generational lines. Similarly, in the UK, young people came out in their thousands protesting against Brexit, and there was a significant divide between what young people voted for in the UK's referendum to leave the European Union and what older demographics have voted for. Regardless of where these swells of civic activism take place, there's a clear pattern. Marginalized or underrepresented groups who feel disenfranchised or disconnected from the political system look for an alternative. Evidence suggests that young people in Northern Ireland are foregoing voting in favour of other means of political participation, protests, petitions, and additional forms of active citizenship. And there's examples that this works. If you look, for example, at Matthew Taylor, who is a mental health youth champion in Northern Ireland and formed at the age of just 16 an entirely youth-led mental health charity in Northern Ireland, and actually was able to get advances in terms of mental health legislation through the work of that charity. Or Lauren Bond, who has a campaign called Teach the Troubles. She is a member of Youth Parliament in Northern Ireland and has been campaigning to make it mandatory in the education system for people in Northern Ireland to learn about the Troubles, because they don't. It's not actually mandatory in Northern Ireland's education system for people to learn about the Troubles that is part of their lives and the Good Friday Agreement. There is a piece of research from Parallel Histories which shows that there's a divide between state schools and Catholic schools in Northern Ireland, with Catholic schools being more inclined to teach the Troubles module and state schools more inclined not to teach the Troubles module. But of course, if young people in Northern Ireland don't take history as a GCSE, which they choose at 15, they'll get basically no information or education about the Good Friday Agreement or the Troubles. And we have a system in place where the majority of young people leaving the education system are likely to have received very little information about the Good Friday Agreement or about the Troubles. So Lauren Bond is campaigning to try and change that, and her campaign is now getting significant traction in Westminster. Historically, meaningful change has often been sparked outside of government buildings by independent campaigners, activists, and civic society organisations. By doing so, they place a duty on the government to enact legislative change. In Northern Ireland, legislative change does not happen very often. But when it does happen, it can usually be traced to a community-based organisation, campaign, activist that has managed to get those changes. And we've seen that recently in campaigns to bring forward mental health legislation, climate change legislation, to bring forward period poverty legislation, and various other elements. One piece of work and one tool that has been effective in trying to engage civic society is the use of citizens' assemblies. Does anybody here know what a citizens' assembly is? You want to share?
Yeah, they use them as like.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, so citizens' assemblies essentially work by recruiting 100 members of the general population to take part in a deliberative democracy process. They will sit for a set period of time. They'll hear evidence and testimony about a particular issue. They will deliberate together, and then they will make policy recommendations, which are then given to the government. Now, there's significant success with this in the Republic of Ireland, where we saw the Citizens' Assembly make recommendations around bringing forward the repealing the 8th Amendment referendum. And the Citizens' Assembly model has actually shown that constitutional change and legislative change is possible through that model. It's also demonstrated that often society is perhaps a bit more ahead than politicians, right? But it's not the only country to use them. In fact, they have many names, and they go back to the 1980s in Denmark. They call them consensus conferences. It's a valuable tool in being able to engage wider society in the kind of changes that might be beneficial and to get buy-in from society about difficult policy changes. I had the immense privilege of leading a citizens' assembly in Northern Ireland just a couple of months ago on the topic of housing. And we recruited 84 citizens from across Northern Ireland through a postal lottery system. So they were sent out, 25,000 letters sent out. People then opt in to take part in the process, and they're selected to be representative of society. And over the course of just 3 days, these citizens, who were not policy heads or academics or people who work within civic society, they were simply regular citizens, were able to take on a complex policy issue of housing and ratify 38 policy recommendations by 80% plus, and also create a shared vision for housing for Northern Ireland, which for me was incredible to witness in terms of just how much capacity there is in empowering wider society to engage in policy issues. And I found that through this system, you're able to engage disengaged communities, increase interest in political systems, and then also build greater levels of community cohesion around particular issues that affect everyone. So that's a really important and valuable process that I have found in being able to engage citizens through that particular process. In terms of the role of women in Northern Ireland, women remain at the forefront of trying to advance equality and being able to address serious issues in terms of violence against women and girls. We have seen an end to large-scale conflict in Northern Ireland, but violence hasn't left Northern Ireland. It's just less visible. We are one of the most dangerous places in Europe to be a woman, with femicide levels outranked only by Romania. The women's movement in Northern Ireland has become stymied by a lack of funding and is often under-recognised and underappreciated for the role it plays in bringing forward legislative changes. At the moment, the women's sector in Northern Ireland is pushing on different issues such as anti-poverty strategy and also trying to bring forward an effective violence against women and girls strategy. In the Republic of Ireland, many progressive steps over the last decade have stemmed from civic society. The Yes for Equality and Repeal the 8th Amendment campaigns brought an undeniable energy and urgency to the steps of Leinster House. I don't know how many people witnessed some of the scenes from the Home to Vote campaign, but having a system where people had to return to Ireland to be able to cast their vote, I mean, Ireland's electoral system is extremely exclusive and outdated. That's a whole separate topic to talk about. But people had to travel home to be able to vote. And people were buying other people flights. People were gathering together and creating this movement to try and get people home to take part in a referendum that people felt was really important. And that demonstrates the power of community. But it also shows that without that movement, those changes probably wouldn't have happened. The political parties in Ireland were holding a more conservative viewpoint at that time, and without the pressure of the Citizens' Assembly first, and then secondly, the pressure of the actual grassroots campaigning that happened around the Home to Vote campaign, it's very hard to see how those changes would actually have been brought forward. A strong civil society is key to strengthening democracy and political participation. Looking to the future of Northern Ireland, one of the greatest challenges we face is in political stability. In 1998, when the mandatory power sharing agreement was put into place, which requires a government that is formed on the basis of having unionist and nationalist cooperation through a mandatory coalition, it was at the time historic. It seemed impossible. The idea of having unionist politicians, nationalist politicians who have divergent political aspirations, one side wanting a united Ireland, the other side wanting to have to remain in part of the UK, seemed impossible. And there was, of course, immense benefits from having a mandatory power sharing government. It created a space where unionist politicians and nationalist politicians learned to work together. But over time, it has become very unstable. In its lifetime, Stormont's Assembly has only sat for 60% of its time, and some of the periods where it hasn't sat have been as long as 5 years. I think going forward, one of the most effective things we could be doing to be able to strengthen the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process would be to reform how the political institutions work. There are things that were necessary in 1998 that might not be necessary today. The fact that politicians in Northern Ireland still have to designate themselves as unionist or nationalist, when we can see through things like the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey that a majority of Northern Ireland's population no longer sees themselves as unionist or nationalist, or likes to use those terms. So why are we still asking our politicians to do it? I think reforming the political institutions is a critical element in being able to also build greater levels of trust in political institutions. Because of the stop-start nature of Northern Ireland's political system, there are really low levels of faith in the political system. A recent survey from Queen's University showed only 19% of respondents expressed trust in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Civic society can bridge the difference between political institutions and wider society, and there's a clear and pressing need to depoliticize the role of civil society. Civil society is an invaluable tool to political representatives. You can kick a contentious issue into civic society and let them find a solution. But in Northern Ireland, too often, civic society is seen as a threat to power or as something to try to stop. The Good Friday Agreement is one of the most successful peace agreements of the past century, but the majority of its mechanisms and commitments to build social cohesion, improve equality, and deliver an economic peace dividend have not actually been realised. I spoke earlier about the various commitments of the Women's Coalition and the Good Friday Agreement, these vital provisions that were going to help build community cohesion and equality in Northern Ireland. They are exactly the provisions that have been left in language. Integrated education is only at 7%. 93% of Northern Ireland schools remain segregated. Mixed housing schemes continue to underdeliver. The Civic Forum, which was the one big ask of the Women's Coalition, lasted 2 years and was disbanded in 2002. We have more peace walls that are literally dividing society today than we had in 1998. And yet, I'm hopeful, as an ever optimist. I do know firsthand the impact that an individual can have, and I also know how difficult it can be to see the impact you might be able to have. How difficult it can be to think that you and your community can effect meaningful change. Kira mentioned when introducing me my previous court case, which I haven't spoken about in a long time. It feels like a distant memory at this point, to be honest. But 10 years ago, I ended up going forward with a court case against the UK Home Office, not intending to start a large campaign or to take on a government department, but thinking that this was just some erroneous error that had been made by a government department and it was all going to be fixed and it would all be grand. That's not really how it worked out. But at the time, I didn't have any experience in campaigning. I didn't have a political background. I wasn't particularly interested in politics. I simply was someone who had experienced a barrier to my rights and felt like it had to be challenged. And over the course of 5 years, I had a lot of people tell me that I couldn't do it. I had a lot of people ask me, why would I not make things easier for myself? And in the end, by persevering, we were able to effect meaningful change in UK legislation under a Conservative government, no less, which was not an easy feat at the time. And I want to bring that up as a reminder to everyone that you all have the capacity to be able to effect change. I know it can be difficult, particularly in tense or divisive political environments, to be able to see how you can create community cohesion or build a movement for change. But I have found firsthand that when you bring people together and you find the commonality that you have, that you're able to build something together and you really can do something with that. Looking forward to the future in Northern Ireland, one of the big civil rights movements to watch is going to be what happens in the event of a referendum being called on the United Ireland. Since the 2016 Brexit referendum, there is no question that the debate around whether or not Ireland should be united has changed. The fact that Northern Ireland voted 56% to remain, and the fact that we were taken out of the European Union against our will, shifted how people perceive the idea of a united or a new Ireland. For many people in Northern Ireland, it is about returning to the European Union and the benefits that come with that. For others, it might be about economic benefits that would come from a united Ireland. Whatever the reason, there's been a significant shift. In 2015, you would not have seen conferences with 5,000 people attending and political leaders from 10 parties on the island of Ireland attending to speak about the potential of a new Ireland. You wouldn't have seen the op-eds, the primetime TV debates. You wouldn't have seen the conferences and the academic research that we now have today. There can be no question that there has been a significant shift in this debate. And we can already see that there's actually the yes and no campaigns are already being developed. We already have campaign groups. We have Ireland's Future, which is based in Northern Ireland, an all-island campaigning group that is going to quite clearly be a yes for unity campaign group. They have several conferences and they publish research and they have a lot of events. We also have the other side. We've got a campaign group already emerging that will be campaigning to remain in the United Kingdom. If you look at Arlene Foster, who's actually a former First Minister for Northern Ireland, she has a group called Together UK. And they're also beginning to make the case for remaining in the Union. We have seen significant political change since the Brexit referendum, and it's not been a particularly good time for political unionism. Since the 2016 Brexit referendum, political unionism in Northern Ireland has lost its majority at Westminster, the Northern Ireland Assembly, and in local government. The largest party in all three of those now is Sinn Féin, who are a nationalist party. There's no question that shows there's a shift in the political landscape of Northern Ireland. And living there, I cannot see that changing. I can't see a return to unionist politicians having a majority in any of those areas in the political institutions. The concern from a civic society perspective is that not enough is being done to prepare for what will be a very complex vote. And we have two very clear examples of an ideal referendum to run and a really not ideal referendum to run. In the sense that we have the Good Friday Agreement referendum in 1998, where there was a document created that outlined very clearly what people were going to be voting for. Then we have Brexit, where there was one question, no information, a lot of misinformation, and a terrible divisive result. So Ireland has two choices. Ireland can have a Brexit referendum and it will prove to be deeply divisive. You could have a result where Northern Ireland votes one way and Republic of Ireland votes another way, and the damage that would be done to relationships if that happened. Or you can create a blueprint like the Good Friday Agreement and outline what people are voting for. But that's going to take a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of investment. If we look at the example of the Scottish government when they were preparing for their Indie referendum, it took the SNP 2 years to create a blueprint for what Scottish independence would look like. I think it would take a lot longer to create something like that in Ireland because it's a lot more complex. In 100 years, you have two very divergent systems. If you look even just at the education system, north and south, these are extremely divergent. And trying to figure out what these large systems would look like in a new Ireland is going to take a lot of work. And then there's, Free Stato, Northern Tato, the Ulster Fry, the Irish Fry. These are going to be divisive debates that need to get worked out before anyone casts a vote. And the challenge we face is that the government is reluctant to take this forward. We have a new Irish government, and both leaders of the two largest parties are very reluctant to be able to advance anything within this area. Other political parties are making advances. Sinn Féin have started doing what they call people's assemblies. It's a little bit like the Citizens' Assembly structure, only maybe not as representative, because it's for people to select themselves in versus being able to actually create a representative body. And the SDLP have their New Ireland Commission, which is also doing similar work to Sinn Féin. It would be great maybe if they worked together on those two areas, but at the moment they're on separate paths. But what we need to do then is create a space for civil society, because it's quite clear that it's going to require community-based movements, women and young people, to be able to take forward what will be the next stage of the peace process. Just like the Good Friday Agreement, the responsibility will fall to everyone who supports the peace process to be able to shoulder that responsibility. And that also includes people over here in the US. In closing, I want to just to speak quite briefly about the concept of positive and negative peace. We celebrate the Good Friday Agreement every year, and we do so for the achievements that have been made over the last 26 years. But if we look at what Northern Ireland actually has, and you consider it in the context of a positive or a negative peace, I would contend that Northern Ireland has a negative peace. When we think of negative peace, what we're talking about is a lack of conflict, a lack of violence, right? And we've established that's not even entirely 100% in Northern Ireland, and I didn't even mention the paramilitaries, which still exist. When we talk about positive peace, we're talking about political stability, economic prosperity, human capital. We do not have those things in Northern Ireland, and lots of that progress has not been made due to a political system that stalls, stops, and can't advance a strong legislative agenda. So I suppose in closing, I want us to think about what is the limit of our ambition when it comes to Northern Ireland, and the limit of our ambition when it comes to peace. Is it good enough to have an absence of violence, or shouldn't we be aspiring for something more? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that really engaging and a really refreshing talk. I particularly appreciate the much broader view of politics you present as something that's not confined to simply institutions, that also very much embraces civil society and the broader view of peace. And also the really inspiring message about how change, the agency that civil society has, that people have to affect change from the bottom up, even in the midst of polarization. And so we have some time now for questions.
Yeah, okay, I'll take here at the back, and then I'll come in into the middle.
Mine's just a request for clarification. You referenced integration and mixed, integrated education system and mixed, and I was like, I just want to make sure I understand what the separation is.
Yeah, and I'll take this one at the same time.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. First of all, do you think it's time that the UK Senate steer government, whether that's Sinn Féin or another progressive party, taking office in the South.
Thank you. They're really good. Thank you. Okay, so first, integrated education versus mixed housing. Okay, it's a good question. So the mixed housing and integrated education are similar. When it comes to housing, it's schemes to ensure that there is mixed in terms of the religious background in communities. So at the moment, there's still going to be places that are dominated by people coming from a Protestant background or dominated by people coming from a Catholic background. And the intention behind mixed housing schemes is to try and integrate those communities, and it's proving to be quite ineffective at the moment. It's similar to the integrated education system because, again, that's about trying to bring together different backgrounds into one space. So they're slightly different names, but basically the same thing. To the point around the Hilary Benn, yes, I remember when Hilary Benn took office, right, he was fantastic on Brexit. And I thought it was very exciting for Northern Ireland that we were going to have such an effective politician taking up the brief as Secretary of State. And then I went to the conference for the Labour Party when he had just taken office a couple of weeks later, and I followed him those 2 days, and every time he saw me I was there with like 3 questions, and interrogating him to no end. He was really sick of seeing me by the end of that conference, and I was really disappointed because I find that his approach to Northern Ireland was really surface level. His approach to legacy in particular is very disappointing. We see that he's actually been denying inquests, for example, denying the inquest for the Sean Brown family. For anyone who doesn't know about the Sean Brown family, there's actually a really good documentary on RTE that I would highly recommend. It's called Murder of a GAA Chairman. Now, this family had been trying to get a public inquest into his murder, and there is evidence released through the courts that there are state agents involved in what happened to this innocent man. There's a lot of cases like that in Northern Ireland that are not being addressed, and Hilary Benn, whilst he is making some changes to the UK Legacy Act, is not taking forward the Stormont House Agreement, which was the previous agreement around legacy, and is still denying inquests for families like the Brown family. Sean Brown's widow is 88 and has been spending the last 20 plus years in court trying to get some semblance of truth as to what happened to her husband. So I'm quite disappointed, in short, by the Secretary of State. And of course, he has said he will not release the criteria for a border poll. He and Keir Starmer have said that they don't think it's a relevant issue at all. And that's the challenge that we face, because there's constructive ambiguity, as we like to call it, in the Good Friday Agreement. Areas where there's a vagueness that was considered at the time necessary to get agreement across the line, and which now we're suffering from because there's no detail. There should be a release of the criteria. If you look at what happened with the independence movement in Scotland, they used things like public opinion polling. Now, if you were to look at the criteria for Northern Ireland, if you were to base it on political representatives, then you could already argue that we're in a space now where there probably should be work towards a referendum. So it's hard to know in what way they're going to make that judgment. Public opinion polling, polling is a snapshot in time of a snapshot of people. And often when it comes to the question of would you vote for United Ireland, it's not getting over 50%. There is a significant increase in people saying they would vote for United Ireland. But I think what's most interesting is that we actually see public opinion polling showing less than 50% support for remaining in the Union. Because there's a difference here, right? People know what living in the UK means. They have no idea what United Ireland is going to look like. And when you're asking people, would you vote for United Ireland tomorrow in an opinion poll, you're asking them to make an emotional response, an uninformed response, because they don't have the information and they haven't been able to consider it. So I think public opinion polling would probably shift considerably if there was actually detail on what a United Ireland would look like. I think there was actually a court case to try and force the Secretary of State to release the criteria for a border poll. It wasn't successful. So it remains to be seen if there'll be a way to try and get that information out of him. Irish government would be pretty good for being able to do that if they had any appetite for being able to take this forward. I think your point around Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil is shared by many people. I think what's interesting is that Leo Varadkar, who was the former Taoiseach and leader of Fine Gael, has obviously left office. He's no longer in politics, and he is speaking at an Ireland's Future conference, Gala, in Philadelphia, no doubt, next month. And since leaving his party, has become a very vocal advocate for preparing for United Ireland and for being able to push the government to do more. My question would be why he felt he couldn't do that when he was actually the leader of that party and also the Taoiseach. Of course, the answer to that is because there must be significant opposition within the parliamentary party within Fine Gael. So, in short, I don't have an answer for if there's going to be anything to move forward with them. I think civic society, if it applied enough pressure, could probably force Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil to shift. They were also against repealing the 8th Amendment, and they had to shift through the Citizens' Assembly model. So, in the case that we don't have significant political change, as for all, there won't be another election for 5 years. That might be the way to push them. Yeah.
You talk about how you said that the nationalists were the largest party post in 2016 post-Brexit. And then you also said that at the same time that the politicians were so invested in the referendum. You said that you required a lot of work and that the politicians were so much slower in investing in that referendum for something to pass to potentially unite Ireland. And you kind of talked about it's like the nationalists who are taking too much time to
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge is that nationalist parties are siloed. Oh, the question was asking, basically about how since 2016 there's been a shift of nationalist parties, but they're not maybe doing enough to actually prepare for a referendum. That's the question, right? Yeah, they're not. Has it been 9 years since Brexit? Oh my God, it feels so long. 9 years since Brexit. And we still have no vision, no plan, no blueprint. They can't tell us what they would like to see at all. And I think that part of the reason that they won't give a position is because they're worried about their own bases, right? So if Sinn Féin came out and said, we support changing the flag, which always is a very emotive topic in this debate, in the event of United Ireland, that could create a pushback from their own base.
And you're talking about changing the tricolour.
Yeah, which always is a very emotional topic, but in the interest of transparency, I advocate for changing the flag. But if Sinn Féin was to say it, I think that they would potentially have a significant push from their own base, right? There's also a degree of...
Sorry, one of the divisions for a lot of people in Ireland is that reunification would mean Northern Ireland becoming part of the Republic, whereas the other vision is that there would be a new Republic created, and that's part of the dynamic there that you're...
Absolutely. This is it, yeah. So the parties are siloed at the minute because they're trying to keep the pie for themselves, right? I mean, really, SDLP and Sinn Féin should be working together to be able to try and create a blueprint or a vision for what a United Ireland would look like, but they don't want to do that. They don't want to share power. They don't want to potentially lose votes to the other side. So there's a little bit of self-political protectionism there, and that is frustrating from a civil society perspective because it's limiting how much progress we're making. 9 years is a very long time, and honestly there's been so little progress made in that time. So yeah, I think you're right. The parties are not doing what they could do. On this point around the New Ireland and the subsuming of the North, as I like to call it, this is a very different, there are two very different ideas of what a United Ireland would look like. There's one where Northern Ireland just joins the Republic of Ireland and everything just continues like normal, okay? And then there's another where everything changes, or a lot changes, right? Because you're making a new state, a new Ireland, and it would have changes. I think that the idea of Northern Ireland just being absorbed by the Irish state would be a complete loser in any referendum. And I think the challenge we have is that there's a perception that the idea of changing the current Irish state in the event of United Ireland is about trying to placate or appease unionists in Northern Ireland. That's not true. I'm not a unionist, and I would really like to see significant changes in the event of a new Ireland. I think it's an incredible opportunity. How often do we get to decide or have a say or have any kind of input as to what kind of state or country we are? That seems like a massive opportunity to change the constitution or change how the political institutions work. I mean, Dublin certainly could do it being decentralised in terms of the power that they have. What would we do with Stormont? Would we have any kind of iteration that would remain? I hope not. But some would advocate other. Will we be able to create an all-island education system that is better than the two systems that we currently have? How can we make the system for voting more inclusive? Can we finally have votes at 16 through that process? Can we have presidential voting rights for Irish citizens who live outside the 26 counties? So for me, I see it as opportunity. And I think the idea of absorption, we've seen what happened in Germany through that. We can see that when German reunification happened, the West subsumed the East. We see that process of just absorbing the other side and not dealing with the economic inequality between these two parts of Germany has actually led to decades of continued division. And we're actually now seeing that borne out in the growth of the far right in East Germany, which of course has found a root in the inequality and othering that is felt between East and West Germany. It's a great lesson to avoid doing what happened there, you know. Anyone else? Yeah?
You had mentioned briefly a potential role for the United States, and I was wondering what you envision that role to look like in any upcoming processes to address it.
It's a good question. I mean, look, the US played a vital role. George Mitchell, who is incredible and did an amazing job. He was making a joke at something I was at recently where he said he was told it would be 6 months and it was 6 years to try and do the negotiations. So I think that was something that was really important through the process, the US having that kind of mediator role. I think that would be very helpful, depending, I guess, on the administration maybe. I think it would be very helpful in terms of having that kind of outside mediator to be able to work through the eventual process of a referendum and what that might look like. But I think there's also a role in the US in terms of a community-based level as well, in terms of being able to learn from each other, in terms of building community, in terms of being able to mobilize Irish communities here as well, because I'd like to see the diaspora and the wider Irish community have a say and a role in what this whole thing is going to look like. I think that's a really important part of it. And sometimes also when people come to the US, there's a different kind of engagement. You know, all the politicians will be in DC this week. There's a massive DUP delegation going. I've been there and they are very different from what they're like back in Northern Ireland because they're away from that environment and there's perhaps more of a freeness in terms of being able to engage differently. So I think the US has a vital role.
I was going to say, earlier in your talk, you mentioned one statistic. You said that it was the peace agreements peace processes are 35% more likely to last for 15 years or more if women are involved. So my question was specifically in the case of Northern Ireland, not just the peace processes, but in the politics in general, and the peace process more specifically, how do you facilitate that process?
Yeah, it's difficult to facilitate because we don't have good processes in place in Northern Ireland. So UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which relates to women, peace and security and women's participation, obviously is a really good tool to have. It was inspired by the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland, but it's not been implemented in Northern Ireland. There actually is a really good paper done by a youth activist, Tara Grace Connolly, on how to bring in different legislation that would bring forward the spirit of 1325, but finding a different way because we can't get that particularly implemented. Other tools that are very effective are things like gender quotas. We have them in the South, where there's gender quotas for women in politics. We don't have them in Northern Ireland. Of course, we do have 2 women leading the government right now, and we do have an increase in women's participation at an assembly level, but at Westminster and at a council level, it is still quite low. So there's lots of things that need to be done to be able to increase women's participation in politics and in public life. And one particular challenge we have that is unique to Northern Ireland is sectarianism. That's still a big challenge. Women are going to face more sexual-based harassment already when they're in public office or in a political space, but there's the added layer of sectarianism in Northern Ireland, which works as a barrier to prevent women from participating. Now, how you fix all that? There's a lot of things that would be necessary, but yeah, I mean, you would bring forward gender quotas, a Bill of Rights. I didn't even mention a Bill of Rights today, but a Bill of Rights was part of the Good Friday Agreement and would have included commitments and protections. It wasn't brought forward. There's a big campaign for it, so that would be an effective tool. Look at other ways to bring forward legislation. Social media is I mean, I can't use the words I'd like to use for social media at the moment. But it's also a platform for women to be able to amplify their voices. So there's a way of trying to balance that. There's the role of the media as well, in terms of the participation of women in the media and how women are portrayed in the media, and whether or not you can actually look and see if you can bring forward protocols or blueprints or some kind of strategy for how you ensure that women's voices are heard in the media. And then, of course, you could try and get a voluntary code within political parties in terms of how they're going to ensure women's participation. There's lots of examples of voluntary codes in other countries that can prove effective if you can't get a legislative change. All those things. And then, of course, the violence against women and girls strategy and proper investment and all that stuff.
I want to see like young people who do like music and like different stuff around that, like reforms. I guess like specifically with like police, because I mean I know like kneecap's like a huge thing. And, like there's like this like article I read about like this like they had like a mural of like a police car burning and like caused this like huge like uproar by everyone. I want to say like what like reforms young people want for policing and stuff like that.
Yeah, who's seen Kneecap? A lot of you are going to have to change that. A lot of you are going to have to change that. It's really good. It's a really good movie. It's a lot of it's tongue-in-cheek. They are an Irish language rap group in Northern Ireland that actually do a lot of really important activism around protecting Indigenous languages and language rights. But they also show a window into the culture of Northern Ireland. And the environment that young people have grown up in the sense that, yes, young people have grown up under a sustained period of peace, but sectarianism is still part and parcel of our everyday lives. We still grow up in an environment where we encounter sectarianism all the time, and you're still in that space where people don't talk about the troubles, but people feel it, you know? In terms of reforms that young people would like to see, there's big push around mental health, and I know Kneecap actually does a lot of campaigning around mental health issues as well, and other actors. I think if anyone has seen Say Nothing, one of the actresses from Say Nothing was receiving an award, I think, at the BAFTAs, and she used it as an opportunity to talk about mental health due to the suicide rates that we have in Northern Ireland and all the other stuff. So mental health reforms, climate and sustainability, investment in community development. You know, we have a space where there isn't enough opportunities for young people to be able to bed themselves into communities, have cross-community activities, have more things to do after school than graffiti or forming Irish language bands or other stuff. So I think when you look at what young people actually want, it's the same things that young people over here probably want, right? It's about opportunity, a better life, equality, same things. Only we have that added layer of being a post-conflict society where everything's just a little bit more difficult.
If I could just jump in there for a second. A lot of the students here are in my Irish Conflict and Peace class. We've been talking a lot about Kneecap and Derry Girls and Say Nothing, and something that the students brought up actually was just how there's a real kind of almost a reclaiming of the narrative, and you know. There's a real power in the kind of ability of young people and other kind of underrepresented voices in politics, you know, being able to kind of tell their own story on their own terms. And I know that storytelling in peace building is something that you've spoken about before.
Yeah, I actually had the great privilege of having Siobhan McSweeney from Derry Girls in New York earlier this week, where she did an in-conversation about the art of storytelling. And if I can send you the video of that, actually. So I'll send you the video of it. Oh, she played Sister Michael in Derry Girls, yeah. And she's just as funny in real life, guys. She's really good. She was really good. But she spoke very powerfully about how art, storytelling, and those mechanisms are actually a vehicle for peace building, right? Because they're a way for people to be able to talk about the difficult issues. And I'm sure if you've watched Derry Girls and Kneecap, you know that we love a bit of humor as a way to try and manage all the bleak, dark stuff that happened in the past. But we do see a resurgence. Derry Girls is a really good example. Lisa McGee has spoken quite well about how she didn't feel that she could make that show, and then she just went ahead and did it. And look what happened. I don't know if you've seen the last episode that actually is about voting for the Good Friday Agreement. If you haven't, I really recommend watching it. It was probably one of the most educational pieces of television that came out over the last 20
And
years.
it's worth watching all the way to the very end.
It is.
The very end is very, very good.
Yeah. It was very emotional. And I'm sure a lot of people got more education from that episode than they got from Northern Ireland's education system about the Good Friday Agreement. So they did us public service. Any other questions? Yeah?
To what degree do you know are women's peace and reconciliation organizations working across lines of sectarian division? And or two, do you know if there's similar kind of collaboration between organizations within Northern Ireland and similar collaborative kind of cross identity organizations within Palestine and Israel, where there's a lot of collaborative organizations, and I wonder if there's linkage between those and
I don't know about the Palestine-Israel collaborations. It's a weak spot in my own knowledge base. I can't speak to that one. But I do know about the Women, Peace and Security. So yes, obviously there's the All-Ireland Women's Forum, which I actually started at the National Women's Council back in 2021. And part of the reason why that was important was because I could see, now that I was working in a women's organisation in Dublin, that there was no space for women on this island to be able to work on women, peace and security and issues of commonality. And there actually, I think, had been a bit of a separation since 1998, North and South. In Northern Ireland, civic society and women's sector is working on a cross-community basis every single day. That is how they work. It is, and compromise is bedded into how civil society works in Northern Ireland because you're just born to do it that way. It's different in the South in the sense that I felt like after 1998 there was perhaps a view that that's great, that's done now, and that's their thing, right? And organizations kind of siloed themselves and focused on their own areas and didn't focus on North-South, right? Because they didn't see the benefit of it. And when we started the forum, there was a lot more work needed to convince actual representatives from Ireland that there was a meaningful benefit to them, a tangible benefit to being a part of this process. And then they did find that actually there was. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a significant uptick of groups working across North and South. We can see that not just within the All-Ireland Women's Forum, but also lots of other groups who have connected through different networks are taking forward joint projects now. And there's also funding being made available for shared island projects. So there's more money available, which always helps because all these organizations are underfunded, and also they usually get funded on an annual basis, which means there's no stability for the organizations. So that encourages cross-border cooperation, and women are doing this work every day, and it's not seen. A good example of this would be we had an all-island peace building conference in Enniskillen, which is in County Fermanagh, which of course, because I was leading it, I made everyone go to County Fermanagh, which if no one knows is a really rural part of Northern Ireland. It has no railways, public transport is terrible, it's beautiful, and I felt it important that everyone make that journey. So we went to Fermanagh. We had 100 women who gathered to talk about women's issues and how we could work together to try and advance change. President Higgins came and was our keynote speaker and stayed for the entire day to be able to see what was being said in the room by these women. We had entire bus loads of loyalist women who are traditionally very unionist in their perspective that joined for this conference. And then we also had some press there. So the BBC was there, right? And the BBC filmed at the conference, and they ran an entire segment on BBC News at 6 for 15 minutes where they brought in 2 commentators to speak about the event. What they decided to speak about was the fact that President Higgins had made a comment about integrated education. They brought on a DUP minister who did not support integrated education, and they brought on a Catholic priest who also did not support integrated education. And the two of them spent 15 minutes talking about how President Higgins had no right to speak about integrated education and should butt out of Northern Ireland's affairs, and who even wants integrated education in the first place. And they showed these spanning shots of the room full of all these women and didn't even mention why we were there. So I think that's a challenge when it comes to women's work. The work is happening, but it's just not recognized, it's not seen, it's not visible, but they're definitely doing the hard graft, and I think they'll be very integral in any movement towards New Ireland.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion, great questions.
Thank you.